Juliet Act 2, Part 2. Romeo has been proposed to by Juliet, oddly enough, but he's managed to find a priest who, for his own reasons, is willing to marry two incredibly young kids without their parents' permission. Kind of a grimy move there by Friar Lawrence, but he thinks it's a case of the ends justifying the means. Now we'll see what complications seem to arise in order to confound these lovers, and whether or not they're able to overcome them before what we know is ultimately coming, their eventual suicide. So we cut away from Romeo and Friar Lawrence, and we find the apparently still drunk Mercutio and Benvolio, who still haven't gone to bed yet, sitting in the marketplace wondering where the heck is Romeo. And so Mercutio begins the conversation. Where the devil should this Romeo be? Came he not home tonight? Benvolio's reply is, not to his father's. I spoke with his man. Ah, that same pale, hard-hearted wench, that Rosaline torments him so, that he will sure run mad. So this is just a reminder for us. Benvolio and Mercutio don't know about Romeo's new emotional state. They still think he's all spun out over Rosaline, and don't understand that Rosaline is a thing of the past. Romeo is now firmly Team Juliet, and he's no longer apparently depressed. He seems to have gotten over his depression quite magically now that he has a new girl in mind. Now, Benvolio changes the subject here to bring back one of the conflicts that was established earlier in Act 2, which is Tybalt, the kinsman of old Capulet, hath sent a letter to his father's house. Now, this is a big deal. Tybalt, remember, swore revenge on Romeo and has apparently issued a formal challenge to Romeo. They have to meet and fight a duel, and if they don't, then that means that Romeo is a coward and a weakling, and he has dishonored his family's name. So this is another example of the magical power of language. By writing this letter to Romeo's house, Tybalt has created a situation where Romeo either has to fight him or where Romeo will have his reputation destroyed. And Mercutio is intrigued by this, because Mercutio knows what Tybalt's letter contained. A challenge on my life. Romeo will answer it. Any man that can write may answer a letter. So when you answer a challenge, that means you'll meet the person to duel. But Mercutio is indicating here that he doesn't think Romeo's really up to fighting in a duel. And you can understand why. Romeo's been walking around like crying all day and all night about Rosaline. Does this seem like somebody who ought to be throwing down in these streets? But Benvolio still feels like Romeo can respond. Nay, he will answer the letter's masters, how he dares being dared. Alas, poor Romeo, he's already dead, stabbed with a white wench's black eye, shot through the ear with a love song, the very pin of his heart cleft with the blind bow boy's butt shaft. Is he a man to encounter Tybalt? So Mercutio has no confidence in Romeo. As far as he's concerned, Romeo is already dead. His body is up and walking around, but Cupid shot him through the ear with a love song arrow. That hard-hearted wench, when she didn't return his love, killed him in Mercutio's mind. And you think he's enough to face up to Tybalt? And Benvolio, who, remember, has fought Tybalt before, asks Mercutio, why, what is Tybalt? Why, more than the Prince of Cats, I can tell you. And in that one line, there's a couple of interesting things happening there. Like, one, that title, Prince of Cats, is going to be a new movie directed by Spike Lee coming out here pretty soon, if they ever get production off the ground once the pandemic is under control. But it will focus, instead of the Romeo and Juliet story, on Tybalt, the fiery, violence-obsessed cousin to Juliet. And there's a world of meaning in that phrase as well. There's a double entendre going on there with, he's more than the Prince of Cats, I can tell you. Now, cat, There's another slang term for cat, which is also a slang term for female genitalia that's sometimes used as a derogatory way to refer to someone who's not quite a man. And when he says he's more than the Prince of Cats, what Mercutio is in a roundabout way saying is that this guy is not one of those. Oh, he's the courageous captain of compliments. He fights as you sing prick song, keeps time, distance, and proportion, rests him the minimum rests, 1, 2, and a third in your bosom. So what Mercutio is saying here is that everybody, when he calls him the courageous captain of compliments, everybody talks about what a great fighter Tybalt is. He fights, he duels the way somebody like Benvolio sings dirty songs for entertainment. He keeps his time like someone who's singing a song. And distance and proportion, he rests just like in music, 1, 2, but then by the third beat, he's got his sword in your chest. He's the very butcher of a silk button, a duelist, a gentleman of the very first house, of the first and second cause. And what Mercutio is saying here is like, yeah, he's famous and he's renowned for fighting duels. And when he says he's a gentleman of the first house, that means he is a first-class sword fighter. And when he says he's a gentleman of the first and second cause, that means Tybalt will duel you and fight you for a good reason, or Tybalt will duel you and fight you for a bad reason. Tybalt doesn't care. Tybalt just likes to fight. But he's dangerous. That's what Mercutio's getting at here. The immortal passado, the punto reverso, the height. And what Mercutio does here is he slips into Italian fencing terms. He's describing the type of moves that Tybalt use in order to kill you. 1, 2, and then 3. Now, Benvolio, who's apparently not up on his fencing terminology, is a bit confused by this. The what? But now we get to see a little bit more about Mercutio and how he truly feels about Tybalt. With this next part of his speech, rather than continuing to talk about what a great fighter Tybalt is, we get to see that Mercutio is actually a little bit jealous of Tybalt because of his reputation as a great fighter. The pox of such antic, lisping, affecting fantasticos, these tuners of new accents. By Jesu, a very good blade, a very tall man, a very good whore. Why, is it not a lamentable thing, grandsire, that we should be thus afflicted with these strange flies, these fashion-mongers, these pardon-mais, who stand so much on the new form that they cannot be at ease on the old bench? Oh, their bones, their bones. And so what Mercutio is decrying here is that people are obsessed with the new style, the new school of fighting that Tybalt embraces, where they're constantly fighting for their reputation out in the streets, so much so that they don't know how to relax. What Mercutio is saying here is he is strictly old school. He'll fight if he has a reason, and he'll whoop you. At least that's what he says. But he's not out here running his mouth trying to build some rep, because he doesn't need to build a rep, because he already knows he's rock solid. This is why he doesn't respect Tybalt. But their conversation gets interrupted because here comes Romeo. Here comes Romeo! Here comes Romeo! But not down Romeo Lane. Without his roe, like a dried herring, flesh, flesh, how thou art fishified. And right away, Mercutio starts cracking on Romeo's physical appearance. Romeo has been up all night, and he looks tired. He's pale, he's got bags under his eyes, and that's what Mercutio is talking about here with him saying he's become fishified. He looks like a dried out fish. And he's more specific with his criticism here when he says he's without his roe, R-O-E. Do you guys know what that is? If you ever eat sushi, which some people like, some people don't. I personally enjoy it. Some types of sushi come with an accoutrement, which is known as roe, R-O-E, which is actually fish eggs. It's similar to caviar. It adds like a different texture to the rice and the fish and soy sauce and the wasabi that normally make up your sushi roll. And with these fish eggs added to it, it adds like these little tiny bubbles almost that like pop inside of your mouth. It's a different texture for the food. But when Mercutio starts talking about roe, he's not talking about fish eggs. He's talking about Romeo's swimmers. He thinks Romeo hasn't been to bed yet because Romeo's been up all night getting it in, having sex. And so he starts teasing Romeo about who did he maybe get it in with. We know it wasn't Rosaline, so where you been, son? Now is he for the numbers that Petrarch flowed in. Now, Petrarch was one of the most famous writers of love poetry from the ancient world. And in the next part here, Mercutio is going to make references to famous women that people wrote love poems about, and how Romeo, if you ask him, none of them compare to Rosaline. Because remember, Mercutio still doesn't know about Juliet. Laura to his lady was but a kitchen wench. Mary, she had a better love to berhyme her. Dido a dowdy, Cleopatra a gypsy, Helen and Hero hildings and harlots, Thisbe a grey eye or so, but not to the purpose. Signor Romeo, bonjour. Now, part of the joke here is like all these ladies, even though they may not stack up to Romeo's woman in terms of looks, at least they had a better poet to write about them. But anyway, Romeo, bonjour, good day. There's a French salutation for your French slop. You gave us the counterfeit fairly last night. And French slop is a little bit of a shot at like the French style of wearing pants. They sagged. They wore their pants loose and low. And so Romeo is looking a little bit disheveled. He still hasn't been to bed since yesterday morning. Or actually not even then, if you think about it. He's been going probably for about 40 hours straight now. But anyway, so here's a French salutation for your French pants. French also famous as lovers. Also famous for their prostitutes, which is a little bit closer to what Mercutio is insinuating about Romeo. You gave us the counterfeit last night. You faked us out last night, Romeo. Romeo, who just got hit by a verbal onslaught, doesn't let that mess with him anymore, though, because he's got Juliet in his heart. And so he says, good morrow to you both. What counterfeit did I give you? There's a typo on this page from the place where I copied and pasted the information. It should be, the slip, sir, the slip. Can you not conceive? And to give somebody the slip in slang terms today means that you like were running and then you laid back in the cut and were able to shake them. You avoided them. You ditched them. All right, the slip, the slip. But again, there's a double entendre here with so much that Mercutio says. Slip is also a name for a lady's undergarment. So the slip, sir, you gave us the slip. You ditched us to go get with some girl. And pardon, Mercutio. So Romeo says, pardon, good Mercutio, my business was great, and in such a case as mine, a man may strain courtesy. So Romeo's like, man, you got me messed up. That's not what it was about. I had important business to attend to, all right? I don't know what you're talking about with this slip stuff. I was doing business. And it was so important that if you feel disrespected, you just got to understand it was important. Now, Mercutio takes that word courtesy and intentionally misinterprets it, punning it into the word curtsy, which is for ladies to bend their knees and for men to bow at the waist. That's as much to say, in such a case as yours, constrains a man to bow at the hams. So Mercutio actually appears to be asking, so Romeo, does that mean you were engaged in homosexual love? To bend at the hamstrings is to bend over. Were you bending over for someone? And Romeo, who understands it, says, meaning to curtsy. And Mercutio says, oh, thou hast most kindly hit it? Oh, so you weren't bent over, you were bending over somebody else. But Romeo, now that he understands it, starts playing word games with Mercutio, having fun with this idea. Because As any guy will tell you in high school, when you get together with your friends the day after a party and they start asking you, did you hit it? Are you really allowed to say no? We in the audience know Romeo didn't really get anywhere with Juliet except a marriage proposal. But can he say that to his boys? So listen to what Romeo has to say here. Thou hast most kindly hit it, a most courteous exposition, says Romeo. So I saw her exposed, is what Romeo is punning on here. Mercutio says, nay, I am the very pink of courtesy. Pink, once again, being a color associated with a woman's sexual genitalia. And Romeo's hitting on that pun, I, pink, the flower. Right. Why then, my pump is well flowered, says Romeo, seeming to indicate that, yeah, he got some last night. Well said. Follow me this just now till thou hast worn out thy pump. What when the single soul of it is worn, the jest may remain after the wearing a single soul singular. So that's a tongue twister here, and Mercutio is having some fun with this idea. Romeo starts talking stuff, saying like, yeah, I got some last night. And Mercutio says, yeah, but really you're just a one pump chump. You're just a one shot and done. You were worn out after a single shot, if you take my meaning. Romeo gets what he's saying and says a single soul jest, solely singular for the singleness. Like that's a simple joke, simple-minded for simple people. And Mercutio, who's having trouble keeping up with Romeo here, says, come between us, good Benvolio, my wits faint. Saying like, Benvolio, you got to break up this fight, peacemaker. I'm losing to Romeo here. But Romeo's not trying to stop. He's having fun. Switching spurs are all cry match, saying keep riding, otherwise I'm going to say I won. Nay, if thy wits run the wild goose chase, I have done, for thou hast more the wild goose in one of your wits, than I am sure, than I have in my whole 5. Was I with you there for the goose? There's a ton of information going on in that. Mercutio and Romeo, when they start going back and forth verbally, they go all over the place. One, I just want to point out, this is one of the earliest known writings of the term wild goose chase. If somebody sends you on a wild goose chase, that means they wasted your time by having you chase a bunch of foolishness that you were never going to be able to catch. So Mercutio says, if you want me to keep riding, you're just trying to send me on a wild goose chase. I'm done. For you have more of the wild goose in one of your wits than I have in my whole 5. So once again, wits meaning senses. I'm sure in your sense of touch, you have more of the wild goose. Now, there's a double entendre there because goose was also a slang term in these days for a prostitute. Mercutio, once again, hinting, I'm pretty sure you say you got some last night. The only way you got some is if you paid for it. Was I there with you, with the goose, insinuating that perhaps Romeo and Mercutio had visited a prostitute before? Now Romeo's response is, thou was never with me for anything when thou was not there for the goose. So Romeo agrees, saying like, yeah, you've never really done anything for me except hang out with me when we were chasing prostitutes. Now, Mercutio's response is, I will bite thee by the ear for that jest. What do geese actually do? Well, if you piss a goose off, it will bite you with its bill, and that stuff hurts. Geese can be very aggressive. You can ask golfers, or you can ask people who live near bodies of water where geese nest. They are not friendly little things. You'll never find a goose in a petting zoo, because they bite, and little kids will say, ow. And so Mercutio, typically in the play here, starts like trying to physically bite Romeo's ear, getting into horseplay or homoeroticism, depending on how you want to interpret it. Romeo pushes him back, nay, good goose, bite not. And now they start talking about goose as a food because they were talking about biting and geese. Now a bite of goose in terms of like, if we cook a goose, how does it taste? Thy wit is a very bitter sweeting, 'tis a most sharp sauce. Saying that like your jokes, Romeo, your quick words hurt. Like they're biting, it's a sharp thing to serve with your goose. But Romeo once again can throw that back at Mercutio by saying, and is it not then well swerved into the sweet goose? Sweet still being a euphemism in some parts of the world for someone who's homosexual. So once again, you can read that as homoerotic between the two of them. And Mercutio says, oh, here's a wit of Chevreul that stretches from an inch narrow to an ell broad. So here's something that swells from something as narrow as an inch to something that's very, very broad. Mercutio perhaps punning on the idea of an erection. Here's Romeo puffing up. Now Romeo says, I'll stretch it out for that word broad. Broad, using it in this sense, not something that's wide, but broad in the sense of the slang term that is derogatory for a woman, which added to the goose proves thee far and wide a broad goose, thereby insinuating that actually if there's anyone here who is homosexual, it's you, Mercutio, for you're the one who plays the broad goose, the female prostitute, far and wide, not in terms of measurement, but in terms of distance, in terms of everybody knows about you, Mercutio. Mercutio, having lost this joke fest with Romeo, is actually happy. Because is Romeo acting depressed anymore? Nah. Why, is this not better now than groaning for thy love? Now art thou sociable. Now art thou Romeo. Now art thou what thou art, by art as well as by thy nature. So Romeo, you're acting like yourself again. He's happy about that. You're acting by like who you are in terms of the way you behave, as well as like who you are naturally. For this driveling love is like a great natural that runs lolling up and down to hide his bauble in a hole. And there's a double entendre there when you're talking about hiding something in a hole, with as much as these guys have been talking about sex in the last few lines. But less politically correct, actually, is what he refers to when he says this driveling love is like a great natural. He's saying that Romeo, up to this point, you've been acting like someone who is mentally handicapped, who has something precious but doesn't know what to do with it, so he runs up and down the street looking for a hole to stick it in. Benvolio, who's finally heard enough of these two idiots, says, stop there, stop there. But Mercutio isn't done yet. Thou desirest me to stop in my tail against the hair. And there's a double entendre there. If you've ever seen wild animals getting it on, the tail is often used. You ask me to stop in my tail, T-A-L-E, in my story, or my T-A-I-L, my sexual organ, when it is against the hair, when it is against the pubic hairs, but not yet having gained entrance. You're stopping me before I have a chance to penetrate, is what Mercutio is saying here. These guys are, and I'm sorry, they're pretty gross. Benvolio seizes on this idea, and he can't resist getting in the locker room talk fun by saying, thou wouldst have made thy tail large. Once again, I had to stop you, otherwise you would become engorged, you would become erect, you would become aroused, and I don't want that. Mercutio says, oh, thou art deceived, I would have made it short, for I was come to the whole depth of my tail. So no, you're wrong. I'm actually a premature ejaculator. I had already finished even before I got done. So actually I was in the process of shrinking, and meant indeed to occupy the argument no longer. Now, after that joke, Romeo gets distracted, and he's actually excited because who enters on stage but the nurse and Peter, and Romeo sees them first. And Romeo is excited when he sees the nurse because he knows this must be Juliet's messenger. I talked to her last night. And so he says, here's goodly gear. Now, Benvolio and Mercutio turn to look to see who Romeo is so excited to see, and they see the old, fat, toothless nurse come rolling towards them, and they're like, really? That's where you spent last night, Romeo? You hit that? So the jokes for Benvolio and Mercutio are just getting started as far as Romeo is concerned. So Mercutio sees her and he says, a sail, a sail. If you've ever seen a sail on a boat, when the wind is behind it, it puffs out. And so what's Mercutio saying about that? The nurse is wearing a white apron. She resembles a ship with the wind at its back. And Benvolio says, two, a shirt and a smock, saying like, yeah, you need two because one shirt is not enough to cover all that up. Now the nurse says, Peter, anon. My fan, Peter. So the nurse out in public has been stomping around looking for Romeo. Remember, he told Juliet what time to send for him, but he didn't tell her where she could find him. So the nurse has been running around the whole city all morning long looking for Romeo. She's hot, she's out of breath, so now that she thinks she's finally found him, she stops and she orders Peter, the man who is escorting her, to start fanning her, because it is not the type of physical activity she is accustomed to. And Mercutio, thinking that she's engaged in other types of physical activities with Romeo, says, "I, good Peter, hide her face. For her fans, the fairer face." Sorry, the spacing got me messed up there. But what he's saying is like, yes, Peter, get out the fan and use it to cover her up because that face is ugly and I would much rather look at her fan. Now the nurse doesn't really pick that up and says, "God ye good morrow, gentlemen," a formal way of saying good morning, gentlemen. To which Mercutio says, "God ye good den, fair gentlewoman," saying good afternoon. You've been running around apparently all day, so yeah, it's actually afternoon. It's not morning anymore. And the nurse says, "Is it good den? Is it good afternoon? 'Tis no less, I tell you, for the body hand of the dial is now upon the prick of noon." And Mercutio just can't stop with the sex jokes here. The hand of the clock is on the prick of noon, saying it just turned noon, it just clicked or pricked or ticked to moon, but prick also, as we talked about in other videos, being a euphemism for a penis. Yes, the hand of the clock is on the penis of noon. Now the nurse does understand that, and she gets offended. "Out upon you! What a man are you?" Saying like, who the heck do you think you are to talk that way to a lady? And Romeo steps in here, "One gentlewoman that God hath made for himself to mar." So don't worry, gentlewoman, this is a man that God has made to make fun of himself. And that's all he does is make himself look like a fool. And the nurse takes some comfort in Romeo stepping up for her and says, "By my troth, 'tis well said, for himself to mar, quotha. Gentlemen, can any of you tell me where I can find the young Romeo?" "I can tell you, but young Romeo will be older when you have found him than he was when you sought him. I am the youngest of that name, for fault of a worse." So Romeo's got a little bit more kind jokes to say to the nurse, saying like, yeah, I'm Romeo, but I'm not young, or at least as young when you were supposed to come and see me, because I was expecting you at 9 and it's already noon. So, but all right, I'm Romeo. "You say well. Yea, is the worst well. Very well took a faith. Wisely, wisely." And so Mercutio is actually making fun of the way the nurse is speaking right now. The nurse, remember, is poor. She's uneducated, but she's trying her best to conduct herself like a gentlewoman. And when Romeo calls her gentlewoman, that's actually a title that's above her station. And so Mercutio starts making fun of this pretense that the nurse is putting on and that Romeo seems to be fooled by, saying like, these grandiose words to make fun of her. So the nurse says, "If you be he, sir, I do desire some confidence with you." Benvolio catches a mistake that the nurse makes. If you've ever been in that situation where you're trying to talk proper, where you're trying to sound fancy, and then you misspeak, it only makes you look dumber. The nurse engages in this, and this is actually one of Shakespeare's favorite forms of humor to work into his plays. It's called malapropism, where characters try to use fancy words but then say the wrong words. And she didn't mean to say, "I do desire some confidence with you." She meant to say, "I desire some conference with you." And so Benvolio makes fun of her by saying she will indict him to some supper, or she will invite him to some supper. To indict means to find guilty of a criminal act. They're just playing on these misspoken words. And so Mercutio says, "A bawd, a bawd, a bawd, so ho!" A bawd being another term for a prostitute or a whore, calling the nurse a prostitute to her face. And Romeo just tries to ignore them. "What hast thou found?" Not a hare, sir, unless a hare, sir, in a Lenten pie. That is something stale, and whore ere it be spent. And then he starts singing this song. And there is, again, a ton of sexual humor, a ton of double entendre, a ton of puns in this. A hare, sir, what have you found? Romeo asks. And Mercutio says, I found a hare, H-A-R-E. I found a rabbit. All right. I found, what are rabbits famous for doing? Rabbits are famous for making babies. I found a hare, but it's not a hare, sir, unless it's in a Lenten pie. Now, hare, H-A-R-E, type of rabbit. Lenten pie needs a little bit more explanation. So during the Christian observance of Lent, it's 40 days and 40 nights of sacrifice. The story goes in Christianity that before Jesus was crucified, he went out into the desert. And he ate, drank, and apparently slept not at all for 40 days and 40 nights. And in the end of that, he was tempted by the devil. And in honor of that sacrifice before Easter, Catholics, I can say, for example, honor those 40 days and 40 nights of deprivation by giving up something sinful for Lent. It's also one of the reasons why Mardi Gras, or Fat Tuesday, is such a big deal in this country. Before people begin to give up their sinful habits, they go out and they engage in all the sin that they can. They have all the fun that they can, because for the next 40 days and 40 nights, they have to be good Catholics. So here, when they talk about a Lenten pie, it was expected in today's Catholicism. On Fridays during Lent, Catholics are not supposed to eat meat. It's why you'll always see fish fries popping up around at churches at that time. It used to be that for 40 days and 40 nights, you couldn't eat meat at all right? And one of the ways people would kind of try to get around that is they would take meat like a rabbit or a hare, and they would put it into a pie. And if you eat it not knowing it's there, then it's not really a sin. So when he's talking about a Lenten pie, somebody put this meat in your Lenten pie. When you talk about meat and pie, the double entendre there should be obvious to anyone who's familiar with the American Pie series of movies, or people who talk about getting a piece. Hey, all right, they're testing the fire alarm. Not the fire alarm. That's me thinking about being in school for too long. Yes, the emergency broadcast system will be playing in the background for the remainder of this until it stops, because I don't want to stop. I got to get this done. But it provides music for Mercutio's song. An old hare whore and an old hare whore is a very good meat in Lent, but a hare that's whore is too much for a score. When it whores ere it be spent. And there's once again a ton of double entendre and jokes there. An old hare whore, an old H-A-R-E, H-O-A-R. Now, hare, we've talked about, is a rabbit, but it also sounds like hair, H-A-I-R, the stuff that grows on your body or on an animal's body. And whore, H-O-A-R, actually just means the color gray. In these times, and you can still hear some people use the term, it's like in the fall or in the spring when you walk outside and the dew is frozen. That's called a hoar frost, and it turns like the grass gray or the leaves gray that are still on the trees. And so that's where that term comes from. So what he's saying here is the old gray rabbit is an old gray rabbit, makes very good meat in Lent. So Romeo, we know you've gone a while without having sex, so you'll probably take whatever you can get, even in this case, if it's old and gray. But a hare that is whore, H-O-A-R, the other meaning for that, the pun would be W-H-O-R-E, or prostitute. Once again, Mercutio is calling the nurse a prostitute. But then he stops and just readdresses himself. Romeo, will you come to your father's? We'll to dinner thither. So Romeo, you want to meet us for dinner? We're going over to your dad's house. Romeo, who just wants them to leave at this point so that he can work out his secret marriage with Juliet, says, I will follow you. And then Mercutio, who can't resist taking one more crack at how old the nurse is, farewell, ancient lady, 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 lady. And then he and Benvolio walk away. Now the nurse has been like doing her best to contain her rage at all the horrible things that Mercutio has been saying to her. Finally, like, pops off. Marry, farewell, I pray you, sir. What a saucy merchant was this, who was so full of his ropery. So who does this guy think he is, essentially? A gentleman nurse that loves to hear himself talk and will speak more in a minute than he will stand to in a month. So don't worry about him. He just loves to hear the sound of his own voice. He'll say more in 1 minute than he'll listen to in an entire month. Don't worry about him. But the nurse is still ticked. And he speak anything against me, I'll take him down. And he were lustier than he is, 20 such jacks. And if I cannot, I'll find those that shall. The nurse is trying, in her clumsy, uneducated way, to say, like, and if he says anything bad about me, I'll drop him. I'll knock him out. And if I can't, I'll drop, and I can drop 20 just like him. But when she says, I'll take him down, and if he were lustier than he is, there's double meanings in that she's perhaps not aware of, that she would take him down and 20 other men just like him. She would do him and 20 other guys just like him. Scurvy knave, I'm none of his flirt gills, I'm none of his skeins mates, and you must stand by too, and suffer every knave to use me at his pleasure. At this, she's talking to Peter, who just witnessed her get, like, verbally assaulted, and a lot of times in the staging, physically assaulted. And Peter, who's supposed to be there for her security, has done nothing to prevent any of this. Peter says, I saw no man use you at his pleasure. If I had, my weapon would have quickly been out, I warrant you. I dare draw as soon as another man if I see occasion and a good quarrel and the law's on my side. So, once again, there's a double entendre there. You saw this man use me at his pleasure. You saw this man disrespect me is what the nurse means, but actually what it sounds like is you saw this man use me for his pleasure. And Peter interprets it the second way, where he's like, I didn't see anybody using you for his pleasure. If I had, I would have gotten my weapon out. Weapon also being a euphemism for penis, and yeah, it's a whole thing. And again, Peter shows himself to be a bit of a coward, where I would draw as quick as any other man if I see reason, if it's a good fight, and if the law's on my side. Very rarely do all three of those things occur at once, so Peter probably doesn't actually fight very much. The nurse tries to pull herself back together. Now, afore God, I am so vexed that every part about me quivers. Scurvy knave! Pray you, sir, a word. And as I told you, my young lady bade me inquire you out. What she bade me say, I will keep to myself. But first, let me tell ye, if ye should lead her into a fool's paradise, as they say, it were a very gross kind of behavior, as they say. For the gentlewoman is young, and therefore, if you should deal double with her, truly it were an ill thing to be offered to any gentlewoman, and very weak dealing. So the nurse is trying to calm herself down. She's so upset, she's shaking, but then she says, like, look, Romeo, Juliet told me to find you. What she told me to say to you, I'm not going to tell you, because I have to tell you something from me first. If you're lying to Juliet, if you're double dealing with Juliet, if you're doing this just to ruin her reputation, that means you're a coward and a weakling. So the nurse says this in a threatening way to Romeo, and so Romeo has to once again convince somebody that his love is true. So what does Romeo do? He starts to swear. Nurse, commend me to thy lady and mistress. I protest unto thee. So once again, he's like, I swear. But before he has a chance to finish, the nurse is like, good enough. Good heart, and a faith, I will tell her as much. Lord, Lord, she will be such a joyful woman. And Romeo, of course, is confused by this, because he didn't get a chance to actually say anything. So he's like, what wilt thou tell her, nurse? Thou dost not mark me. You're not listening to me. I will tell her, sir, that you do protest, which, as I take it, is a gentlemanlike author. So the nurse is saying, hey, you protested. That's good enough for me. So Romeo kind of shakes that off and is like, let's get down to business. Bid her devise some means to come to shrift this afternoon. So tell Juliet she has to go to confession this afternoon. And there she shall at Friar Lawrence's cell be shrived and married. So tell her to go to confession. When she goes to the church for confession, she's actually going to get married. You follow? And so the nurse is nodding along, and then he offers the nurse money. Here is for thy pains. No, truly, sir, not a penny. Go to, I say you shall. So Romeo has to offer her the money twice because she refuses to take his money the first time. This afternoon, sir. Well, she shall be there. So Juliet's going to do it. Now Romeo's not done with his plan yet. Here's part two. And stay, good nurse, behind the abbey wall. Within this hour my man shall be with thee, and bring thee cords made like a tackled stair. So, nurse, go behind the wall of the church and wait there. I've got my guy coming to meet you there with a rope ladder, which to the high top gallant of my joy must be my convoy in the secret night. Farewell, be trusty, and I'll quit thy pains. Farewell, commend me to thy mistress. So nurse, before you leave, go and wait outside the church for my servant. He's going to bring you a rope ladder. Now, Juliet and I are going to get married in the afternoon, and that means we're not going to be able to have our wedding night right away. And Juliet can't like just disappear after she says she's going to confession, or her parents will freak out. So she'll go back home, not tell anyone she's gotten married, and then that night I will use the rope ladder to sneak into her room so we can have our honeymoon. And it's about more than actually just like having sex. It's about having sex, but not in terms of like the physical pursuit of pleasure. A wedding that takes place, but if the bride and groom do not have sex during this time, it is considered unconsummated, which means it's not real, it's not official, and it can be annulled by the church. And this time the church didn't do divorces, but if you got married and then like before you actually had sex with them, you're like, no. You could get that marriage canceled out as long as you hadn't had sex with them. So Romeo, in order to finalize the deal, has to sneak into Juliet's room that night. So the nurse says, God in heaven bless thee. Hark you, sir. Now listen to me. And Romeo says, what sayest thou, my dear nurse? Is your man secret? Did you never hear say, two may keep counsel, putting one away? So the nurse is saying, can we trust your servant? Because two people can keep a secret if one of them's dead. The nurse is proposing to murder Romeo's servant for him. And Romeo's like, I warrant thee, my man's as true as steel. Like, please don't kill my servant. He's a good dude who's working for me and bringing you the rope ladder. Don't worry about him. He's good. He's cool. Well, sir, my mistress is the sweetest lady, Lord, Lord, when 'twas a little prating thing. Oh, there's a noble man in town, one Paris, that would fain lay knife aboard, but she, good soul, had as lief see a toad, a very toad, as see him. I anger her sometimes and tell her that Paris is the properer man, but I'll warrant you, when I say so, she looks as pale as any clout in the versal world. So the nurse is trying in her own clumsy way to compliment Romeo by saying like, oh, Romeo, you don't know how wonderful Juliet is. She has a chance to marry Paris, who, let's be honest, is probably better than you. But every time I tell her that, she gets really mad at me. So don't worry, Romeo. Juliet is as true a woman as you could possibly fall in love with. And then the nurse goes off and asks this like really random question. Do not Rosemary and Romeo both begin with a letter? Do Rosemary and Romeo begin with the same letter? Rosemary is an herb that was also at this time like very popular as like decorative for weddings. All right, and so the nurse is saying like Rosemary, Romeo. They both begin with the same letter. This must mean something good. And Romeo, of course, is confused by this connection and says, like, I nurse, what of that? Both with an R. But when Romeo pronounces the letter R, the nurse, who is illiterate, doesn't know that Romeo and Rosemary both begin with a symbol that is signified in terms of speech by the sound R. So she thinks Romeo is just making the sound R. At which the nurse thinks Romeo is joking and says, oh, mocker, that's the dog's name. Because dogs say R. R is for the, and then she stops herself from saying R is for the arse, which is the way British people pronounce your backside. No, it begins with some other letter, and she hath the prettiest sententious of you and Rosemary. That would you do good to hear it. So Juliet was talking about how Romeo and Rosemary both begin with the same letter, but I think you got it wrong, Romeo. But if you could hear Juliet talk about it, it would make you so happy. Romeo, who's done here, just says, commend me to thy lady. So represent me to Juliet. The nurse says, aye, 1,000 times. Romeo leaves, and now the nurse says, Peter. Peter says, anon, now. Peter, take my fan and go before me a pace. And now she starts her way first to get the rope ladder, and then to go meet up with Juliet. So we cut to the final scene of this act, and we actually get some characterization for Juliet. We get to see her being human. A lot of people point to Juliet's soliloquy here as proof that she is not innocent, that she is not virtuous, that she's not really a good girl. I point to it as humanizing for Juliet. She's just like every other person. Because remember, Juliet was supposed to hear back from Romeo that morning. She sent the nurse out at 9. When the nurse goes and talks to Mercutio and Benvolio and Romeo, it's afternoon. So Juliet's been waiting for like hours now. You think she's getting a little impatient. That's what Juliet's talking about here. The clock struck 9 when I did send the nurse. In half an hour she promised to return. Perchance she cannot meet him. That's not so. Oh, she is lame. Now, Juliet's getting impatient here. The nurse said she'd be back in half an hour. It's been over 3 hours now. Maybe she couldn't find Romeo. No, that can't be the case. She's lame. Not meaning like the nurse isn't cool, meaning like the nurse is physically, what lame actually means is crippled. So, love's heralds should be thoughts, which 10 times faster glide than the sun's beams, driving back shadows over luring hills. So what she's saying here is, I wish that lovers were able to communicate with just thoughts. That way we could think to each other faster than our messengers can travel, because thoughts fly faster than light. Therefore do nimble-pinioned doves draw love, and therefore he hath wind-swift Cupid wings. So she starts thinking about mythology. The chariot of Aphrodite is pulled by doves. Cupid has wings to help him fly. Now is the sun upon the highmost hill of his day journey. From 9 till 12 is 3 long hours, and yet she is not come. Had she affections as warm in youthful blood, she would be as swift in motion as a ball. My words would bandy her to my sweet love, and his to me. But old folks, many fain as they were dead, unwieldy, slow, heavy, and pale as lead. So, I wish the nurse could just understand how I felt. If she knew what it was like to be young, she would sprint to Romeo and then sprint back. But these old folks, they don't know what it is to be in love. They act like they're dead the way they live their lives. Oh God, here she comes. And here comes the nurse and Peter. Oh, honey nurse, what thy news? Hast thou met with him? Send thy man away. So Juliet comes running up, and she almost like spoils the secret by saying in front of Peter, did you meet with him? Did he say yes? And Peter's just confused by this, so Juliet's like, send your man away. So the nurse says, Peter, stay at the gate. Peter leaves. Now, good sweet nurse, O Lord, why lookest thou sad? Though news be sad, yet tell them merrily, if good, thou shamest the music of sweet news by playing it to me with so sour a face. What's happening here in the action that you don't see from the words unless you're paying very close attention is the nurse is messing with Juliet right now. The nurse is pretending that she has sad news, and she's got a sad look on her face. So when Juliet asks, like, what's the news? The nurse frowns and shakes her head, and Juliet's like, oh God, what did he say? And now the nurse, for the first time probably in her life, is in a position of power over Juliet. So the nurse is going to enjoy this. I am a-weary, give me leave a while. Fie, how my bones ache, what a jaunt I've had. So the nurse, rather than giving Juliet the answer she so desperately wants, is just like, oh, I'm so tired, my bones hurt. So Juliet is like, I would thou hadst my bones, and I thy news. Nay, come, I pray thee, speak, good nurse, speak. So Juliet's like, I wish you had my bones and you had your news. If I had to trade bones with you to get this news, I would do it. Just tell me what's going on, nurse. And the nurse, Jesu, what haste? Can you not stay a while? Do you not see that I'm out of breath? Now, there is some irony in that Juliet is about to hit on. How art thou out of breath when thou hast breath to say to me that thou art out of breath? The excuse that thou doth make in this delay is longer than the tale it does excuse. Is thy news good or bad? Answer to that. Say either, and I'll stay the circumstance. Let me be satisfied. Is good or bad? So Juliet's like, you're out of breath. Say one word. Good or bad? Tell me that much. And the nurse sighs, says, well, you have made a simple choice. You know not how to choose a man. So it starts off sounding pretty bad. You made a dumb choice. You don't know how to choose a man. Romeo? No, not he. Though his face be better than any man's, yet his leg excels all man, and as for hand, foot, and a body, though they are not to be talked on, yet they are past compare. So the nurse starts off saying, like, Romeo isn't really a very good man, but then she starts talking about all of Romeo's good quality. He has a handsome face, he has nice legs, he has a good body, but we're not supposed to talk about that. He is not the very flower of courtesy, but I'll warrant him as gentle as a lamb. Go thy ways, wench, serve God. What, have you dined at home? So the nurse brings Juliet right up to the very urge where, like, first it sounds bad, then wait a minute, maybe it's good. And then the nurse is about to say, like, go your ways. But before she says, and marry Romeo, she interrupts herself and says, like, what, did you already eat dinner? And Juliet says, no, but all this did I know before. What says he of our marriage? What of that? Oh, Lord, how my head aches. What a head have I. It beats as it would fall in 20 pieces. My back, oh, the other side, my back. Beshrew your heart for sending me about to catch my death with jaunting up and down. So the nurse gets off topic again, starts complaining, oh, I've got a headache, my back hurts. Oh no, Juliet, rub my back on the other side. So clearly she's conned Juliet into giving her a back rub in order to get this news. Faith, I am sorry that thou art not well. Sweet, sweet, sweet nurse, tell me, what says my love? Your love says, like an honest gentleman, and a courteous, and a kind, and a handsome, and, I warrant, a virtuous. Where's your mother? So once again, the nurse brings Juliet right up to the point where he's about to say, like, Romeo says he wants to marry you, but instead, where's your mom? Juliet pretty much snaps at that. Where's my mother? She's within. Where should she be? How oddly thou repliest. Your love says like an honest gentleman, where's your mother? Now, Juliet's pretty much shouting at the nurse at this point, and the nurse says, oh, God's lady dear, are you so hot? Mary, come up, I trow. This is the poultice for my aching bones. Henceforward, do your own messages yourself. Oh, you're so hot and angry that you're going to yell at me now, Juliet? This is the way you treat me, making myself all tired and sore to be your messenger? Well, fine. You can carry your own messages from now on. I'm done with you. Juliet says, here's such a coil. Come, what says Romeo? Have you got leave to go to shrift today? Do you have permission to go to confession today? I have. Then hie you hence to Friar Lawrence's cell. There stays a husband to make you a wife. So the nurse finally spills the beans. Go to Friar Lawrence's today for confession. You've got a husband waiting for you there, and you're going to get married. Now, we don't hear Juliet's response to this, but the nurse tells us what it is. Now comes the wanton blood up in your cheeks. They'll be scarlet straight at any news. So Juliet starts blushing really hard when she hears that, and the nurse calls her on it. Hie you to church, I must another way to fetch a ladder, by the which your love must climb a bird's nest soon when it's dark. I am the drudge and toil in your delight, but you shall bear the burden soon at night. Go, all to dinner, hie you to the cell. So, Juliet, Romeo's waiting for you at Friar Lawrence's cell. You're going to go give confession, but really get married. And then I've got another job to do. Even though I should get to rest Juliet, I've got to go meet somebody who's going to give me a rope ladder that Romeo's going to use to sneak into your room tonight so y'all can have your wedding night. I'm going to go get some food. Juliet, get you to the priest. Now, Juliet is ecstatic. Hie to high fortune, honest nurse, farewell. And Juliet runs out of there. Now, interestingly, we don't see the wedding. We get this last scene right before the wedding, but Romeo and Juliet do not get married on stage. Instead, we cut to the actual climax of the play. If this had been a comedy with a happy ending, we would have got to see the wedding. But remember, kids, this is a tragedy. And so the next scene is going to contain the action, the climax, the turning point from which there is no return. So instead, we just get this little moment before the wedding where Friar Lawrence is praying. So smile the heavens upon this holy act that after hours sorrow chide us not. So please, God, help this go right. I really can't have it go wrong. Friar Lawrence knows he's doing something wrong here. And Romeo hears his prayer and says, Amen, amen, but come what sorrow can, it cannot countervail the exchange of joy that one short minute gives me in her sight. Saying, like, how can anything bad come from this, Friar Lawrence? 1 minute of looking at Juliet outweighs all of the sadness the world can possibly throw at me. Do thou but close our hands with holy words, then love devouring death do what he dare. It is enough that I but call her mine. And for the audience, once again, there's a ton of dramatic irony in these words. Romeo says, just marry us, Father. And for that one instant that she is mine and I am hers, I can die in the next and die a happy man. And Romeo thinks he's talking about something romantic, but Friar Lawrence says that's a messed up thing to say. These violent delights have violent ends, and in their triumph die like fire and powder, which as they kiss, consume. So Romeo, I'm worried about the way you're looking at this love you have for Juliet. It's like gunpowder. The second it kisses fire, it goes boom. Don't let your love be like that. The sweetest honey is loathsome in its own deliciousness, and in the taste confounds the appetite. Have you ever eaten a dessert that's so rich that, like, you get a little bit of it and you're like, wow, that's good, but I am done? That's what Friar Lawrence is talking about here. Your love is too overpowering. It's too sweet. It's too much. You need to dial it down a little bit, son. Therefore, love moderately. Long love doth so. Too swift arrives as tardy as too slow. So Romeo, if you try to rush into this, you try to be Mr. Loverboy time 10,000, you're going to screw this up. Calm down. Be cool. Getting there too fast is just as bad as getting there too slow. Maybe you two can both get there together, if you know what I'm seeing, says Friar Lawrence. And as they're having their conversation, Juliet walks in, and it's interesting. This speech is given to Friar Lawrence, though a lot of times in the action it's taken by Romeo, the way the director chooses to split it up, because it's a little bit weird for Friar Lawrence to be talking about Juliet like this, unless he has a thing for Juliet. Here comes the lady, oh, so light a foot will never wear out the everlasting flint. A lover may bestride the gossamer that ides the idles in the wanton summer air, and yet not fall, so light is vanity. So here comes Juliet, and look at her. She is so light on her feet. She's got springs in her feet. Lovers who are in love can walk on spider webs and never break them. Juliet says, "Good even to my ghostly confessor." Friar Lawrence's response is, "Romeo shall thank thee, daughter, for us both." So Romeo has more words to greet you with than I do. Juliet says, "As much to him, else he thanks me too much." So usually the action that gets played here is that like Romeo runs up and tries to just like grab Juliet and start kissing her, and Juliet's like, "Whoa, slow down, Romeo. I greet him as formally and respectfully as I can, but we're not married yet." And so Romeo tries to encourage her. "Ah, Juliet, if the measure of thy joy be heaped like mine, then that thy skill be more to blazon it, then sweeten with thy breath this neighbor air, and let the rich music's tongue unfold the imagined happiness that both receive in either by this dear encounter." All right, so Juliet, if I can't kiss you, then talk to me and just perfume the air with your sweet breath and tell me how wonderful it is to see me. Which is kind of a narcissistic way to look at love, but that's Romeo. And Juliet calls him on that. Like, "Romeo, you sound conceited, you sound full of yourself." Conceit, more rich in matter than in words, brags of his substance, not of ornament. What she's saying here is that if you can put your words to your love, if you can put your love into words, if you can express your love with words, it's not really love. Love is way too big. Love is shown with action, not with words. So Romeo, I'm not going to say a bunch of flowery words right now. I'm here to marry you. That's the action that matters. And then she drives the point home with this analogy. They are but beggars that can count their worth. My true love is grown to such excess that I cannot sum up. I'll try it one more time. I cannot sum up some of half my wealth. And that's a tongue twister there. I screwed it up. But what she's saying is it hard for a poor person to count all their money? Well, I'm broke. Let's see. 0 plus 0 multiplied by 0. Plus I got 0 in that bank account, which is earning 0 interest. So yeah, still got 0. It does not take a poor person very long to count their money. What about a billionaire? Does Jeff Bezos have a hard time, even if he wanted to? Could he sit down and count his billions of dollars if he had them all with him? No, he'd be counting for the rest of his natural born life. And that's what Juliet is saying about her love. I cannot count my love. I cannot speak my love because my love is too vast and too big for words. So Friar Lawrence catches Juliet's meaning here, saying, "Enough words, let's get to the action." And Friar Lawrence says, come with me. We will make short work, for by your leaves you shall not stay alone till the Holy Church incorporate two as one." So Friar Lawrence is like, "All right, let's go do this. I'm not going to give you guys 1 minute together when you're not married alone." So they go off to get married. There's the end of Act 2. Hope you guys enjoyed it. I'll try and get one more Act 3 video out before the end of the year. I know technically the grading window is closed, but I'm a bad teacher who sometimes submits grades late. So if you're still working, please continue. And I hope you guys, even if you're just doing this for enrichment, are enjoying it. I'll get another enrichment activity out for you guys as soon as I can. All right. That's enough for today. I hope you guys are having a good one, and I will talk to you soon.